Café with Cavanha brings today the topic cybersecurity in supply chain with Professor Stephen Carnovale, Assistant Professor of Supply Chain Management at Rochester Institute of Technology. Good morning, Professor Stephen.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine, and you. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure, it's a pleasure. Stephen, please, you mentioned in a LinkedIn post that the costs for a cyber attacks may reach $4 million or something like that. Could you please explain us a little bit more?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because cybersecurity, I guess, has been around in one way or another for such a long time. But when you rewind back maybe 10, 15 years, you can think about cybersecurity, and the focus of it was really on a company protecting themselves. And this was, of course, before, because before I got into academia, I was actually in IT. So I used to sell hardware and software. And one of the things that we did was we built out data centers for companies. And so back then, even as little as 10, 15 years ago, the company, they'd build out a data center, and then they'd have what we call a redundant data center, right? So if this one went down, then, we'd have this one over here. So you think about that, and cybersecurity at the time was, change your passwords, and maybe something got breached internally where somebody's confidential information got lost. Then you move to where we are now with cloud computing in particular, and distributed technologies and global commerce, everything the way it is. The costs of these breaches are happening in so many different ways. So that $4 million number, on the one hand, there's a cost associated with it, just recuperating whatever downtime your systems aren't actually operating. Then there's the cost in terms of the reputational impact that it can have. I watched one of your previous videos with a good friend of mine, Zach Rogers, and he described the Target issue. Well, that's just a classic example of costs coming from so many different ways. On the one hand, the systems went down, there were costs. On the other hand, there's reputational costs. And then there's the liability for what actually goes wrong as a result of a cyber breach. One of the things that I really think about, and I like science fiction, so maybe that's why I think about these things, but with the Internet of Things becoming really, really popular, at least proliferating where there's a chip in nearly everything, I started thinking about medical devices, and if those medical devices had a chip inside of them, could we be at the point where a person could be hacked, where their internals could be hacked? And so at first, that's kind of a silly idea maybe, but then you step back and you think about it from a supply chain standpoint. There's a company manufacturing, there's a supplier providing those parts, there's the person, most importantly perhaps, providing that chip. And so what costs are we looking at there? There could be human costs. Of course, people could get injured and die. So, it's a challenging thing to sum up what's the cost of a cyber breach. And those estimates, they do their best, but the numbers are, they're astounding. Before this call, I just pulled the most recent data that I could find. And Gartner expects that worldwide by 2022, the total cybersecurity spending just on prevention, which I think we're going to get to, but I wanted to kind of give you an idea, just on prevention is going to reach just about $134 billion. So this is, it's the wild, wild west in supply chain. It really is an interesting topic.
And how companies can measure this consequence and this cost of prevention? How you compare the things?
It's a tough thing, cost benefit, I guess, is the way we would think about it. In the traditional way, I go back to my example about the redundant data centers. There, it's very easy to do a cost benefit, because what we could say is, well, if we lose downtime, or rather, if our servers are down for 4 hours and we process X amount of volume per hour, this is what it's going to cost. So it's worth it in the long run to invest this much money in a new data center. On the other hand, now with distributed technology and with really cloud computing impacting the way that those things are done, there's no need for that kind of redundancy. So when we're thinking about how to prepare for that, it's a challenging thing to estimate. You know, some industry reports put it at 10% of your IT spend. So what they say is, depending on the size of the company, it could be between, I think the number was about 0.2 to about 1% of your overall budget. So that number sounds great, and it's an easy, benchmark to think about. But I think industries have to think about this differently, because if you're in an industry where piracy is kind of the cost of doing business, you're going to think about cybersecurity spending a lot differently than, for example, if you're in assembly of manufacturing where there's not really a proprietary process involved. So how to think about it, right now, some of the work that's being done, people are doing some analytical and mathematical modeling to kind of say what's the probability, or what's the expected value of a loss and how much should we hedge against it. But the interesting thing is, when you say how much to spend on cyber, well, what does that really mean? On the one hand, does it mean investing in training for personnel? Because that's a really big issue as well. A lot of these issues happen because a Word document pops up that looks completely legitimate, but in fact, it's really not. So do you invest in money in training, kind of like we used to talk about with quality or with Six Sigma? Or do you invest money in something like insurance? Well, cyber insurance sounds great, but we've all had issues with insurance policies where there was one tiny exception and then the policy doesn't exist anymore, or at least it's not covered. So it's a really challenging thing for me to give an exact answer to. And actually, I'm hoping that the book that we're writing, I'm hoping that some of the contributions from the authors will kind of help us to figure that out.
Let me ask you something that's very curious for me. Which part of the supply chain is more vulnerable?
I think once you extend outside of that focal company, the Target, the Citibank, the whatever, once you're looking at first or second tier suppliers, I think that's where the vulnerabilities exist. Because, I think Target was a great example because it was just a small HVAC supplier, heating and cooling supplier, and they were operating not great technology. I think it might have been the free version of Norton or something like that. And so that's not really a key supplier of Target. You wouldn't really think twice about, why would I attack an HVAC supplier? Well, they're tied into their ERP system. And so they penetrated that way. And so when you're looking at where the vulnerabilities in the supply chain exist, it's easy enough to think about going after the big guys, thinking about going after the name brands, but they know everybody wants to go after them. And I think that's the work that Zach and his team are doing, where they're looking at the different configurations of how an attack actually happens. And I think some of the work that they've done so far concludes that really it's the second and maybe even third tier of the supply chain that's the most vulnerable.
You mentioned that you are writing a book about supply chain, cybersecurity and supply chain. Could you please tell a little bit more about this?
Yeah. So the book, myself and a colleague of mine are co-editing the book, and we're inviting chapters about all topics on cybersecurity. What I'm really interested to see in the submissions that we've gotten in so far, they're really interesting. One of them kind of frames the problem, because that's partly the issue too, is what exactly is supply chain and cybersecurity. So we hope to explain that. We also hope to discuss where along the supply chain cybersecurity matters. So when we're thinking about it from a sourcing standpoint, we're thinking about it from a manufacturing standpoint, we're thinking about it from a distribution standpoint. It's two interesting examples that I came across in manufacturing and distribution as it relates to cyber. In the manufacturing space, one thing that I had never thought about prior to starting this project was about 3D printing. So if you're a manufacturer and you're working with suppliers that you've enabled them or you've empowered them by giving them 3D CAD drawings of a part that they're producing for you, well, that's proprietary technology that many other companies against whom you compete they'd love to be able to see that kind of stuff. So that's a really interesting application. How do you guard the supply chain against that kind of cybersecurity or that theft? And the other one, from a distribution standpoint, kind of goes back to what we were talking about intelligent body parts in terms of, body part replacements. Well, a lot of the sensors that get put on pallets for fresh fruits and things like that, they end up picking up the gases that emit from the fruit. And so with the IoT, the Internet of Things, it kicks off a signal to a database, and now we know kind of when we need to pull over or vent the cab or something like this. Well, think about, from a negative standpoint, if a competitor were to be able to hack that system and get inside, they could say, everything's fine. You can drive from California to wherever you want, And so these kind of things. And I think it's all born out of, my view, my research in supply chain is mostly on risk and networks. So it was a natural extension for us to look at all these topics in cyber. It's just so interesting. And that's kind of what we're looking at with the book.
Excellent. Stephen, one more point, please. What companies must do to be protected, or it's impossible?
Boy. I think the easiest thing to do is think about it from the lens of risk management. So in risk management and supply chain, what we talk about is there's three different things that are really important. There's companies developing the ability to detect. There's companies that need to develop the ability to mitigate. And companies need to develop the ability to recover from a disruption. So you take that same logic and put it into cybersecurity, it's the same exact thing. The detection ability, here you see tools, there's a great advertisement in the United States about Norton, and they partnered with this identity theft company, and they show these people in this big data center where they're monitoring threats all the time. Well, companies have to adopt similar processes like that. And so what do? Adhering their IT departments to follow what's called NIST, N-I-S-T, standards. Those are government standards in the U.S. that mandate how cyber security should be coordinated to buffer against these issues. So first, you're kind of developing this detection mechanism through buffering. The next thing, from a mitigation standpoint, as you said, it's kind of impossible to protect against everything, right? So from the mitigation standpoint, what do we do to kind of hedge against the inevitability of this happening? So one great example from risk management is manufacturers sometimes will have safety stock. If a disruption in the supply chain occurs, they use this other endpoint to service the demand or the production, whatever the case is. From the context of cyber, I think it's really interesting now that we're in the cloud space, the redundancy and the way that people or companies are thinking about how to be redundant with their data. It's very different, but still the same kind of processes exist. Backups that are not necessarily online backups, or periodic backups in different areas or different clusters, or even different cloud service providers. So that's the mitigation piece. And then finally, the recovery piece, knowing that it's going to happen, developing kind of the capabilities to be able to bounce back. So in that regard, in the risk management space, companies will often have partnerships with other suppliers that they don't use very frequently, but in a multi-sourcing setup, they can easily shift capacity if they had to. That's the same kind of thing companies need to focus on for cybersecurity. And the recovery piece are things like probably insurance, hedging against the inevitable costs that the company is going to have. And, the thing about the costs associated with all this, too, I don't know if I mentioned it before, a lot of people think about it like it's going to cost the company money either in downtime in production or liability. But the long-term consequences are actually, I think, even something even bigger, because the reputational risk that can happen, a lot of people get kind of skittish about going to Target, at least in the aftermath of that attack they did. Not me, I was there this week, so I guess I shouldn't really talk, but that's the idea. So the reputational risks, aside from everything, are really challenging as well. So yeah, to sum it up, I think if you're a company looking to prepare think about it in terms of detection, mitigation, and recovery, and how do you guard yourself at each of those phases in the process.
So I see that to be protected is not impossible, but extremely complex, no?
Yeah, very, very complex. And I mean, I think everybody who's in this industry would say you're going to have a breach or an attack of some kind. I mean, even recently here, we do our annual reviews at my university in September. And so after that's done, you know, typically you'd get a message from the dean or the dean's assistant saying, here's your performance review, or at least it's available. And so I wasn't thinking one day, and I got an email with the name of our dean and everything like that. And I went, okay, yep. And I clicked the document. Luckily, I have a product on my machine that intercepted it and said, don't open that, you know. But even me, a guy who researches and studies this stuff, it happens, you know. It's going to happen. It's like getting the common cold. Everybody's going to get the cold. But if you take your vitamin C, hopefully it protects against the downside, right? And that's kind of what we're thinking about it from a cybersecurity standpoint.
Excellent. Exactly. We appreciate having Professor Stephen Carnovale with us today. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you.
Pleasure.